Hey everyone, so today's video is going to be about the casts of each Big Brother season, and I will rank how all of the BBUSA season's cast holds up, and it is going to include Big Brother 23. So I will rank them from the worst cast to the best cast, talk about some of the gems of each cast, the duds that offered nothing, talk about how much of a ratio there is between the two, so on and so forth. So at dead last at 22nd is Big Brother 14. It is so clear that with mixed seasons, they tend to have a lot of the newbies be cast as fodder, while all the focus and twists benefit the veterans, and there's no bigger example than this. Brittany, Dan, Janelle, and Bookie were clearly given some tools to push themselves forward, and even Janelle was kind of a dud in this season. The only newbies that really stood out were Frank and Ian in this season, and of course, everything became about Dan from about the first third onwards. Names like Jody, Kara, Willie, Jojo, Will, Ashley, Joe, Jen, and honestly, even arguably Shane and Danielle, despite them being in the majority alliance and winning comps, are just so forgettable to me and many other people. It's easily the most front-loaded cast of Big Brother, and I don't like front-loaded casts. So at 21 is Big Brother 15. Simply put, it's done this low because most of the cast is very, very unlikable. And this was technically the second, but it was the first where there was all 16 casts and all of them were new players. This would go on and on until even today, honestly. And there's definitely some, I would say, wrinkles that needed to be ironed out with this new format. The only real standouts to me, though I dislike half of them, were Helen, Helen, Nick, despite his early boot, and Judd. Candace and Jesse were okay for the underdogs who eventually got pwned and argued with the house. But people like David, Jeremy, Caitlin, Howard, McCrae, and Spencer, and even Andy, to be honest, were kind of duds. Gina Marie was a personality, but she was just so unlikable. They had to force Alyssa to being the likable underdog, but she just really wasn't likable, and she always complained about production and stuff like that. And Erin, even outside of her racism, just wasn't likable at all. At 20 is 16, and honestly, I didn't intentionally rank all of these seasons consecutively as they are in canon, but it just so happened to have happened like that. Honestly, it's another 16-player cast, and that format generally sucks. And the biggest complaint I have is the female cast is very, very, very weak. I feel like the only not dud female that was cast was Nicole, but even I don't like her in this season. Joey, Paola, Brittany, Amber, Jocasta, and Victoria offered very little in the season, and Christine was supposed to be a NUD-ist. That's how she was kind of portrayed, but then she ended up being a dud in the house. And even some of the men, like Hayden and Cody, were very much duds. Honestly, even Donnie was kind of a dud, since he isolated himself from that house, but because everyone else kind of sucked, they had to force him into being an underdog. Devin and Zach had personality, though I didn't really like them. Frankie, while I don't like him, definitely wasn't a dud. And Caleb is the stereotypical CBS guy that would get pushed to the front and have all of his violence kind of hidden. And Derek is the mastermind, so I can't say I put him as a dud. At 19, I have Big Brother 13. Wow, I have 4 of the early to mid-aught seasons out back to back to back. Anyways, this season has a lot of the same issues that Big Brother 14 has, but to not the same extent, where most of the focus was clearly around the veterans and a lot of the newbies cast were intended to be fodder and not as interesting. But I do think the newbies in this season, as a collective, were much stronger, and the ratio between duds and not duds are a lot more equal. Anyways, the duds of the season were Dick, due to him being ejected early due to his situation, Cassie, Lawan, Braden, who's just awful this season, Jordan, who's awful in the season, neither of them really offered much at all, Adam, and Porsche. Keith definitely had personality, though it was kind of an obnoxious one. Dominic had a lot of potential and was a likable force from the little time he was in the house. Danielle was one of the sole people who made the season somewhat interesting. Same with Kalia, she was a really strong rookie who made a mark on the season. And even Shelly, she was kind of a rat for the veterans, but then she came into her own and just did what she did. Jeff and Rachel, while I don't really like either one of them, they were very polarizing figures in the season, and they had a lot of arcs, and the strategy revolved around them a lot, so I can't really say they're duds either. At 18 is Big Brother 22, and I usually have the season ranked as last for everything. But clearly, because all of them were cast before and they chose specific people who made a mark on their Big Brother seasons, they obviously couldn't be last because returning players they handpicked. But even with that, a majority of the ones in this season are duds. Keisha, Nicole A, Bailey, and Ian, I always forget are even on this season because they're just duds. David was a very, very, very poor choice, and it was clear he was only put on because the casting of black males were so horrible for the last decade up to that point. Tyler didn't even want to be there, and it was honestly just very embarrassing. Memphis and Christmas, I don't know if they are duds, but they just didn't interest me at all, and they're just kind of like grumpy, irritating people who are on the season. They kind of reminded me of like angry grandpas who just sit in the corner and like sneer at everyone, if that makes sense. So Janelle and Kaysar, honestly, even they were kind of duds in this season, though they're better than half of the cast, which doesn't seem much. Kevin was kind of an in-between of a dud and a solid casting choice, though it was nice to see him come back 11 years later. He changed so much and clearly was very fragile. Devon is going to Devon, so I can't really say she was a dud, and they kind of forced her into being an underdog. Same with Danielle, she's always going to be that snaky, somewhat messy player. Nicole, Enzo, and Cody had a lot of the strategy revolve around them. And while they weren't duds strategically or any of that stuff, I just didn't care for or like them. At 17th is Big Brother 4, and I honestly had this as the lowest for a very, very, very long time. This was the first season where they intentionally cast younger, and the quota of all the Houseguests being strangers of the first 3 seasons were completely broken. They also casted to have a lot of focus on romance and hooking up, and it was a mixed result. Scott and Amanda and Michelle honestly weren't good choices for the show at all, and they clearly didn't fit. Justin, G, and Robert were supposed to be the quote-unquote underdogs of this season, but they had a lot of misogynistic elements in them, and all of them were just very, very, very boring. Out of the 3, I guess G was the best casting choice, since he is an Asian male who did well on the season, and that isn't common. David and Dana had very bold personalities and kind of made the early game interesting. Nathan on any other early season would probably be the dud, but because of his crazy moves and his messiness and his being kind of a derp, he had some funny moments. Jack was a unique casting choice and he was very funny. Erica's kind of an in-between of a dud and a solid casting choice, since she was very vulnerable and led to some interesting moments, but she was kind of just meh overall. Allison and June, whether you like or dislike them, controlled the strategy of the season and are very polarizing personalities. But their cattiness also made the season very dark and uncomfortable to watch as well, without any of the drama that is attached to seasons like this. At 16 is Big Brother 12, and I never got the hype over this cast. I think people act like this cast is great because the television edit that was given, and they had to put a lot of effort into making that interesting with the cast, especially with the horrible diary rooms that many of them gave. So the duds, in my opinion, are Monet, Kristen, Kathy, Reagan, Lane, and Hayden, despite the Brigade Alliance, and so was the only telegenic person in that alliance. Brittany, Brendan, Matt, Rachel, Andrew, and Annie were the only slightly interesting ones, and even half of them didn't live up to their full potential in my opinion. I am actually shocked that I have Big Brother 21 at 15, as I thought it was going to be a lot lower. A lot of these people are very, very, very unlikable. So people like Nick, Jackson, Holly, Catherine, and Christy were just awful. Though I think people like Catherine would have been great in any other season because she just has that personality. Jessica, Nicole, and Cliff, and even Tommy were the clear standouts when it came to casting. David was a horrible dud. I don't even think she should have been on the show at all. Ovi, Kemi, Bella, forgettable Sam, Jack, and Annalise also just didn't add much to the season at all, in my opinion. Arguably one of the most unlikable and forgettable casts at the same time, but there aren't as many duds who contributed absolutely nothing compared to the ones below them. I have Big Brother 18 at 14, and I honestly don't really know how to feel about this, since there are 4 vets on the season, but it wasn't like they carried the show, since the newbies held their own. So Glenn, Bronte, Zakia, Bridget, Corey, and James were other duds, as well as Frank, so that is half of the veterans who I feel like didn't contribute much to the season. But there are also huge standouts like Jersey with his personality, Tiffany, Devon, and Polly with their mess, Michelle with her antics, Natalie, Victor, Paul, and Nicole were also interesting players in their seasons who contributed a lot as well. So there's a decent amount of duds, but a lot of likable standouts as well. Big Brother 19 is at 13, and I honestly thought the season was going to be lower. But at the same time, while I don't like the cast, there aren't a whole lot of duds. The duds, in my opinion, included Cameron, Jillian, Ramses, Elena, Matt, and Christmas, since they essentially offered little to nothing in the season, and you could remove them and nothing would really change. Dominique was an interesting casting choice, though you only saw her potential during her last week. Jessica and Cody were clear standouts, whether you like them or you dislike them. I thought Mark was a good casting choice, and he offered more drama than you would expect from him. Jason, Raven, Alex, Kevin, Paul, and Josh are also very solid casting choices, whether you like them or not. Big Brother 9 is at 12, and I honestly thought this season was going to be dead last at some point, since it's arguably one of the most unlikable casts in Big Brother, but now that I think back on it, even a lot of the early boots offer a lot to the table. So early boots like Parker, Jen, Amanda, Alex, and Allison were definitely interesting and aren't forgettable. Matt, James, Natalie, Sheila, and Adam are very solid personalities that brought a lot to their seasons and you don't forget about either. Jacob and Neil were kinda duds. Joshua was horrible and he wasn't even interesting. I know people act like Sharon's one of the only likable people on the season, but she was honestly just a bore in my opinion and didn't contribute much to the season at all. Ryan, it was clear that he was cast to be with Jen, and Jen would have been on any other Big Brother season on her own. Chelsea is kind of a mix between a dud and a solid casting choice, so she's kind of just hanging in the middle. At 11 is Big Brother 23. It's weird because this cast definitely does have a lot of potential and there are some interesting personalities, but what was executed on the season are a lot of forgettable people and a lot of people who essentially did very little to nothing in the season. So obviously a lot of the earlier boots like Travis, Brent, and Whitney just weren't good in my opinion. And even a lot of the later boots like Claire and Alyssa were very forgettable to me and didn't offer much at all. Xavier wasn't a master strategist at all or an interesting personality, though it was clear he was going to win from day one. I guess Frenchie brought a lot within his 2 weeks in this season. Christian had potential, though he wasn't a dad, but he wasn't a really great casting choice. There aren't many people like Brittany on the cast. It was nice to have a solid Asian male representation in Derek X, though I think he's very overrated. Sarah Beth had some good moments in the latter parts of the season, but even she wasn't great. In my opinion, Tiffany's the only real standout character and strategist of the season, and she kind of carries the cast in my opinion. Kynan was definitely unique compared to many other house guests, so though while I don't like him, I can't say he's a dud. Azza is an interesting personality as well, though she was a dud strategically. Derek F, yeah, the less said about him, the better. And Hannah wasn't great to me either, and I feel like if she wasn't brought into the cookout, she would have been very forgettable. Heck, she's forgettable even despite being a part of the cookout, but because she was close with Tiffany, people kind of elevate her, if that makes sense. Honestly, this cast is better on paper than in execution, but is far from the worst. So at number 10 is Big Brother 20. There are a lot of people who think this is one of the best casts ever, and there are a lot of people who think that this cast is very overrated. And honestly, I am very in between. I do think people like Angela, JC, Casey, Rachel, and Steve were duds, and Sam's just, while entertaining, probably shouldn't have been cast. While people like Swaggy, Winston, Caitlyn, Bailey, Rockstar, Faisal, Scotty, Haley, Brett, and Tyler at least brought something to the table, whether it's entertainment wise or strategically wise, though some of these people were very boring or borderline boring as well. Not the worst, but not the best. At 9, I have Big Brother 8. For the longest time, I thought the season had a bunch of duds, but now that I'm reflecting on it, it actually is a lot stronger than I initially thought. Most of the duds were actually the pre-jurors, so people like Carol, Mike, and Nick, though I think Nick had potential to be more interesting had he lasted longer, were booted early, and I think the boot order is why this season ended up being as interesting as it did. Though Zach could have gone a lot earlier, and he was arguably the biggest dud in the entire season. Everyone else, like Joe and Kale during the short times in the season, Dustin, Jen, Amber, Jessica, Eric, Jamika, and whether you like them or not, Dick and Danielle brought a lot to the table. They aren't the most likable, but they were engaging at least. At number 8 is Big Brother 6, and it's mainly here because some of the duds that were on this cast were huge duds. So people like Ashleigh, Michael, Sarah, so most of the pre-jurors, or a majority of the pre-jurors, were duds in my opinion. And even people like Bo and Maggie, people who made it far, and while Maggie was a good strategist, she didn't really own it. Neither one of them really offered a whole lot to the table, despite having a few decent moments. People like Eric, Kesar, Rachel, James, Howie, April, Janelle, and Yvette are all polarizing personalities who made the season a lot more interesting than it probably should have been. I kind of forgot to mention Jennifer, and she's in the middle of a dud and a decent casting choice, kind of like Bo and Maggie. At 7 is Big Brother 7, the first All Stars. So obviously, this season has an advantage of having everyone on this cast were previous house guests, and they chose some of the most notable people from that era. So even this cast, while some of them are duds, they are a lot more telegenic than most other Big Brother casts. So the obvious duds to me are Nokomis, Diane, Kesar, Marcellus, and honestly even kind of Howie, as I found Howie and Marcellus's novelty wore off. Nokomis and Diane were so out of their element, and what made Kesar great in his season just wasn't here in All Stars. Everyone else, like early flameouts like Allison and Jace, brought a lot to the table, and the endgamers of James, Danielle, Chicken George, Will, Janelle, and Bookie really carried the season. Erica was kind of a dad and kind of wasn't. She did have kind of like a sad, tragic storyline, which was somewhat interesting, but she just didn't stand a chance against a lot of the others in the cast. At 6 is Big Brother 2, and I think this cast hugely benefited because they were 12 complete strangers from complete different worlds, and the cast is generally older. There are only really 3 duds in my opinion, like Justin, who shouldn't have been cast, Cheryl, and Autumn. So the first 3 boots generally. Everyone else has their part to play and were huge polarizing personalities. Shannon and Bookie caused a lot of the conflict in the early weeks of the season. Kent was very polarizing and had an interesting storyline. Krista was someone who was America's sweetheart but fell from grace. Bunky had to learn how to toughen up, and he really had this engaging storyline where he didn't put up with any crap. Hardy was the interesting hero turned into the interesting villain with Nicole, and as they both slit everyone's throat, Monica kept it real and she was very authentic, and I don't even really need to say anything about Will. Just a sheer great cast, and it's almost like a fairy tale where everyone has their part and it's wrapped up like a perfect little bow by the end of it. At number 5 is Big Brother 10, and now we're at the heavyweight in my opinion. I do think the season heavily benefited from a great boot order, as I feel like most of the pre-jurors, technically half of them, like Steven and Angie, were kinda duds, and Audie was the only remaining dud. Only having 3 duds in the cast is very great in my opinion. Brian and Jesse were great early boot flameouts. Libra, April, Michelle, Rennie, and Keisha were the strongest female cast ever. Memphis was okay. Dan and Jerry were also very solid casting choices. I like that they were all diverse in ages and race and beliefs, and you really had that back to basics feeling of how they cast way back in the early 2000s. That was missing for a few years in between those times and since the season. At number 4 is Big Brother 5. I don't know what happened with this casting, but it seems like they went out of their way to cast more telegenic and eccentric personalities, and it worked really well in my opinion. The only 3 duds in my opinion are Lori, who was the second boot, Natalie, who I think would have been great had she been cast on her own and had her chance to be her own player from the beginning, and Drew, which kind of sucks since he's the winner, and the winner is arguably the most boring person in the cast. But everyone from Mike stirring stuff up before he left, Holly being very unique, Scott and Jace were great early season and first half villains. Will was a great confessionalist and narrator. Adria held her own despite her weird beliefs. Marvin and Karis are hilarious. Diane is electric strategically, and I found her to be engaging personally. Nokomis was very unique, and Cowboy, while I don't care for him, he's definitely unique. So at number 3 is Big Brother 3, and they have similar casting to Big Brother 2, but I felt like they went for more humorous and less vile people in this season, so it worked. In general, there are only 2 duds in this cast, and they are early boots, Tanya and Eric. Lori left a huge impression despite being a first boot. Josh was someone that made you feel something whether you liked him or hated him, and while you hated him at first, you actually kind of felt bad for him by the end of his run. Kiara was a very progressive woman, especially for 2002. Jerry stirred stuff up and was definitely interesting. Roddy, Marcellus, Amy, Jason, Danielle, and Lisa are all strong characters who contributed a lot to the season and are people you can't really forget at all. While this cast was lacking in drama, you felt for this cast regarding humanity, and they're really, really, really funny. At number 2, I have Big Brother 11. For a season that's generally ranked either in the low tier or the middle tier in most people's opinions, I feel like this cast is really, really, really strong. The only 2 people I didn't think should have been cast were Brayden, who was just a dud even for his archetype, and Natalie, who was just cringe in every single way and wasn't compelling at all. Laura was an interesting second boot. Casey and Ronnie were also great early boot characters who were very compelling in their own ways and stood out in a good reason. Jesse was a great character, and he improved strategically here, while seeing everyone go crazy over him was nice. Chima, while I don't think she should have been cast for her mental state, she was a huge character in the season, and you definitely won't forget about her. Lydia and Russell, especially Russell, are complete nutcases, and seeing them just ravage through the house was nice to see, especially when the foolishness started happening. Jeff and Jordan, while I don't really care for them, I do think they are solid casting choices for that archetype. Michelle and Kevin are great too, while both of them are oddballs in their own ways. So at number 1 is Big Brother 17. Literally every single person in this cast contributed to the overall dynamics of the season and made it better, which is hard to say for most casts. The only people that I feel like the cast could have done without are Jeff and Jackie, who honestly were kind of just there for the entire time. Julia, who suffered from the same thing Natalie did in Big Brother 5, so she had her great moments. And Steve, who definitely fits his archetype, but was kind of a lot more awkward, hence him not getting a lot of camera time. But he was good for what he contributed for him. Jace, Devon, Audrey, Jason, and even Clayforce Archetype are great early boot pre-jurors who all contributed to the season and made the pre-jury as lively as it was. Shelly was a great early juror, early villain who had a great downfall, and you kind of start to see her picture-perfect persona kind of crack. Meg and James were hilarious in the season. Becky and her randomness was great. Austin, while I didn't like, was a great strategist and he had many moments as well. John, while overrated, is also a unique character. Liz was pretty nice as well, and Vanessa is a huge standout. She's just iconic in every single way, and it's so refreshing just to see a kick butt and take on names female player like her, which has been missing since and before her. So that is how I rank the cast of Big Brother USA. I'm probably going to start making a bit more BBUS videos, and I'm looking forward to seeing what I will come up with next. Thank you all for watching this, and I'll be back soon.